Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing There Is Nothing for You Here by Fiona Hill. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Fiona Hill served famously for 2 years in the National Security Council under Donald Trump. In the Trump administration, she also testified against him at his first impeachment hearing as it related to him trying to dig up dirt on Joe Biden using Ukraine, trying to call in political favors from the Ukrainians to try to dig up dirt on Joe and Hunter Biden, and she famously testified against him. This book is, I would say, a few different things. It is her memoir in parts. It is her theory that America is slowly becoming Russia. By that, she means being led by autocrats. And it's also a policy prescription to how to spread opportunity around in the 21st century. The book's subtitle is Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And so it's a lot of different stuff. And I think the things that I liked about it, her life is very interesting. She grew up as a literal coal miner's daughter in the areas of England that were really deindustrialized during Margaret Thatcher. Her dad went from being a coal miner to working in a nearby hospital, and her family was essentially on the poverty line for most of the time that she was growing up. She left England and studied at Harvard, where she met her husband, and she also studied abroad in Moscow, and she came to the U.S., and over time she got her PhD and became something of an expert in Russia. She wrote a book on Vladimir Putin, and she was a member of Brookings, which is a think tank. So this is kind of the precursor to her joining the National Security Council under Trump. Through the book, she talks about her fights with sexism and times in her life where she dealt with sexism, especially in the hiring portions of it, making sure that she was getting equal pay. She says that she was like the victim of discrimination in certain places. And so I thought anytime that she talked about her lived experience, I thought that was interesting. I thought the chapters with Trump, where she's working with Trump, are probably the most interesting stuff. I don't know how much new you'd learn about Donald Trump. I did learn that I didn't realize before that he has a spot in his, in as far as his policy concerns for nuclear non-proliferation. I didn't realize that was something he cared deeply about, but she puts forward that he does care about that. And she kind of talks about her time with him and the power struggles in the administration. Talks about Brexit and how it was a forerunner for the rise of Donald Trump being elected. So throughout that stuff, I thought there was an interesting perspective. The 2008, she acknowledges 2007, 2008, the Great Recession, was a really important turning point in a lot of things. So I thought that stuff was all good. I think where the cons were, there are a few different areas of cons that I had with the book. I found the book to be quite repetitive, and I thought it could have been trimmed down quite a bit. The last 50 pages of the book are really her policy prescriptions to how America can avoid populism and tamp down populism. And that kind of seemed to keep going on, and I didn't really feel like that was anything, groundbreaking. Maybe it's part because I've read in the last year Adrift and The Fight to Save the Town and Of Boys and Men and Dream Hoarders, and The Last Best Hope, which is probably the best, which unfortunately I didn't get to review for the channel. Those other books I have reviewed for the channel, I'll leave those below. Of Boys and Men, it would have been an interesting book for her to have read. I know that book actually came out after this one, but it's her fellow Brookings Institute fellow Richard Reeves, and he has kind of a different perspective on sexism than she does. Some of her stuff about the gender wage gap, I will say Fiona Hill is about 20 years older than I am, and so her experiences in the workforce, I think, were more common for women in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s. But a lot of those things, like not knowing to negotiate wages, not being able to find wage information, which is now readily available online. I think even then, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you could be able to find some of that stuff. So that stuff, how sympathetic you are to her. She kind of surprisingly talks about money quite a bit. And it's always interesting when you read someone's partly biography, and you kind of see their blind spots, what I perceive to be blind spots. Fiona Hill's husband, who she met at Harvard as an undergrad, has now gone on to get a master's degree, so I think they're relatively quite comfortable. And the issues that I was reading sometimes, and I go, well, that's happened to me, Fiona. People have offered me much, much lower money than what you would think given the average of the title of the job. And that's happened to me. I think it's happened to a lot of people. Now, I'm not in, academia or policy or anything like that. I'm much more in the private sector. But I think some of those things that I think she saw as kind of clearly sexist, some of that I think is just things that people do because they can get away with it. Now, the other things about her feeling like that in the workplace is not something I can speak to. If that's the way that she felt, I'm not trying to take anything away from her. If there were, in fact, elements of sexism, I can't really speak to it. And I fully accept that she was a victim of sexism at certain times. There is a part in the book where some of this stuff is anecdotal. She says several times that, systemic racism is a huge problem in the United States. And she gives a story about one of her classmates in Harvard in 1989 having almost like a do the right thing moment where he has an issue with some guy at a pizza parlor who was racist towards him. And I was like, I think you need a little bit more than that to just kind of make that as a fact, like this is a thing. And again, she's someone who's coming from England, which is a very different culture and very different understanding of things. And I thought that there should have been maybe more there. She basically cites one book, which I haven't read, but every time I read reviews of it, the word cherry-picked comes up very often. And so I was kind of bothered by that. It wasn't so much the first or second time she did it, but she says it 3 or 4 different times. And it doesn't really fit in with her overall theory, which is part of the issue that we have is that college education is not more readily available to people. And then you kind of dive into the statistics, and she says, I think everybody should have at least have some college experience. I think millennials are at 67%. And if you look at the group that's achieved, by 30, the most education, Black women disproportionately have more education than any other group in terms of requiring and this is a 2014 study, so it may have changed post-COVID, but as of 2014, disproportionately, they have more education than any other group of people, which would kind of, again, push against some of these things. And I don't think, college access is the problem. I think 67% of millennials have at least some college. That number may have changed slightly. It could only have gone up because they're not making any more of us. But, the access to college really isn't the problem so much. And then it gets into a question of, going back to the debt trap. If you have a universal access program, people acknowledge that college is worth it and it pays off in the long run for the vast majority of people. Why do we have so much debt? And is college access really a problem? And I would argue it's not really a problem. And she kind of gets into these I would say she gets real blurry when she talks about the solutions of some of these things. At one point she says, we need to find a way to make it so that everybody, no matter where they live in America, has opportunities to fulfill their dreams. Or they fulfill their highest ambition wherever they live. I think that sounds wonderful, but then she also says, but we have to also accept that we're going to have unequal opportunity in America. And so sometimes I feel like she's, for the most of the book up to that point, populism is this terrible thing, and Donald Trump's followers being the largest populist movement, we need to find a way to bring them into the fold. And then when you get into the solutions, it's kind of a grab bag of different policies, and none of them really feel up to the task. And I re-listened to the end of Last Best Hope by George Packer, which has kind of a similar setup to basically saying, this is really dangerous what's happening with Trump. We need to find a way this group of people have not had all the opportunities. We need basically a new contract for America. And there at least, say whatever you want about George Packer and the realism of his ideas, he puts forward probably 6 or 7 or 10 different programs that would really radically change things. It would, of course, though, be extremely expensive and take a very long time, and he acknowledges those things. Here she says things like, well, we need to have an NHS-style system, and I think I could see the benefit of that, especially if you're talking about things like deaths of despair. But if the issue is that people feel that they are not able to achieve, in terms of financial success, what they're trying to achieve, the NHS system, again, to me, would be a secondary or tertiary. It wouldn't be a main thing. And at one point she seems to acknowledge, since 2008, she looks at some of the people who went to the Capitol who were avowed Trump supporters. And she says, in a weird kind of, in one of the few points of the book, she's not as direct as she usually is. She says, and some of them may have had economic downturns during the 2008 financial crisis that were harmful to them. And it's like, are you coming from this from a sense of empathy and wanting to help these people, or are you coming from a sense of, I just want to solve this problem, or are you coming from a sense of, this is not going to solve their problem, but it's going to solve other people's problems? And it kind of all gets real complicated in this book. And I think the book would have been better served if it had just been Fiona Hill's time in the White House, and maybe more about the theory of America becoming Russia, because she doesn't really touch on that as at any other point other than maybe through the government. So it ignores things like immigration and birth rate and innovation and income per person and job opportunities. It just kind of ignores those things and basically just says, well, America is becoming Russia because at the top you have this issue and there's deindustrialization. And she has different, again, ideas to try to deal with the deindustrialization, but none of them kind of get to the core issue, which is really jobs. And she says at some point, well, maybe we could have tourism be an issue, an answer for some people, and these companies are going to have to, or these places are going to have to find their own way forward in finding economic opportunities for themselves, which is really the fight to save the town. That's what that book is. And I think, for me at least, the clear evidence, the takeaway from that is it's kind of a grab bag that people have been trying to do all these things. And even in areas where they want to find new ways of bringing in revenue once a resource like timber mining, for instance, has gone away, it's been a very mixed bag. And the hopeful point in that book isn't additional industry coming to town. It's basically we were able to raise taxes to pay for emergency services. So at the whole of her thing, in my opinion, having read it, of Fiona Hill's book, is there wasn't anything from an economic standpoint to go to these people and say, you used to be coal miners, or you used to be loggers, or you used to be whatever your industry was. Some you used to work in a factory, whatever it is. Here's something that's going to replace it to get you kind of close to there. And she says she has kind of really vague statements like, companies should be more tied to education. So when people graduate, they have a more direct path to jobs, and companies should work to, the tech industry should work to broaden its geographic areas in which it tries to recruit from. And I just kept reading it, well, they should do that, but they haven't done that. And it's been, 20 years since Web 2.0, since Facebook was released, and they haven't done it. Silicon Valley, superstar cities, the Rockonomics, if you want to read, whatever you want to read to show that the concentration of jobs have been in very, very few places, it's there. She doesn't get to the point of, and we should legislate it. She just says, yeah, companies should do this. Okay, and they haven't, but they should, but they haven't. And so you kind of get this weird cycle of just, it would be nice. And it would just kind of like, well, what is the point of you saying these things? I think a lot of people believe them. And again, going back to George Packer, whatever you believe of George Packer and the realism of a lot of those things, he basically says, and these things should be legislated. You should have a law related to unions. You should have a law related to 2 years of college. It should be free for everybody. You should have universal health care. You should have much, much more, basically essentially a New Deal to repair the social safety net. Now, again, he doesn't get into the cost. She doesn't go into the cost here. It's more of, I think these things would be beneficial. And you're sitting there going, I don't think these are ideas that are new. I don't think they're ideas that are different. I think a lot of what she's saying is the same for other things that I've read. A lot of this seemed similar to me to what Scott Galloway said in Adrift. It was just, for me, it's strange because she seems to have this real fear that America will become Russia in just the worst ways possible, but doesn't really seem to have anything other than kind of platitudes to help the people that she thinks will be I hate to use the term, tip of the spear in that change. And so I kind of was frustrated by it. And then also, finally, I'll call it quits here for this one. I think, again, she views her life in a way where I don't think she realized some of the stuff that was working for her just wouldn't work for a lot of people. What do I mean by that? She's a very, very social person. She has a huge network of friends, and she kind of talks about that. And I remember reading this, and because she talks about college students and college students finding their path, and she seems to really, really, really hate debt, like hate college debt, like Dave Ramsey style hates college debt. And I was just sitting there going, I don't think most Americans, and I should say, especially I don't think most introverted people would want to do like the song of the dance of like going to the Rotary Club or going to the 4-H club and getting involved in this and getting involved in that, just so they don't have like $20,000 of debt. Some will. Some are just going to say, I don't want to do that. I want to focus on my studies, and I want to go to the interview, and I want to get a job. I don't want to do all the like networking and stuff. And so she doesn't really seem to get that part of it for her. She says at some point that like everybody networks, and I just go, I don't think they do. I think some people do, and some people feel they have to. Other people just apply to a lot of jobs and get a job and just want to do that. And so that part of it too kind of bothered me, because there was an absolutism there that I think came from her personal experience that isn't true for a lot of people. And then also the not really understanding her husband being like a second source of income, and that whole thing, and being kind of separate from the people who she's trying to help in some ways, but she's also trying to help all these other people. And it's just, the whole thing I thought was kind of a mash. And the parts of it I liked, I thought were okay, but it's kind of surrounded by a bunch of other stuff that I was less impressed by. And part of that's going to be because I've read several similar books to where this is what's wrong with America. This is what we should do to fix it. I just don't know if she's that person. And I think that in some ways it was interesting to get her perspective on it, in terms of like the UK and Russia and the United States. But even in those things, I do think most people realize the deprivations of Russia and are worried about becoming it. But if you were going to explain to people the deprivations of Russia, you would get into, infrastructure bills and things like that, and how the bridges and roads and airports are crumbling. And she doesn't really touch on that. She does say in the ebook that I read this on ebook and on hardcover, she does mention that she's a fan of the Build Back Better and the infrastructure bills and things like that. Again, I think that she believes that that's going to be a cure-all to fix a lot of these things. But those don't necessarily go down to how do you give people who are in areas that have been economically deprived jobs. And I don't think she has a clear enough of a vision that doesn't feel like just spaghetti on the wall. And I didn't know why she felt that she needed to take on that mantle, because I think it's been done everywhere else. And again, I think she's a clear enough writer to where you can read this and there's the parts of it that you can take away. But the other parts, I think maybe just because it's the last 50 pages, you're just reading this and go, okay, well, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. That's a good idea. But I've read these things, in other places, and there's nothing really that's like putting meat on these bones. Like for instance, she says, I think senior citizens should form essentially networks with younger people and offer up their, now I remember what I wanted to say, and offer up their services to younger people. Okay. Are you calling for the government to do that? Are you calling for them to just to form this alliance just ad hoc? Is it everybody? Is it just some people? Is it going to be through the college? Like, how are you going to do this? And just kind of just throws the idea out there. I remember what I was going to close with, and this bothered me again in Fight to Save the Town. I was in a program called AmeriCorps. It's similar to a domestic Peace Corps. It's a program that was founded in 1993, yet people it's not really something that's particularly well known in the culture. She literally describes the calls for a national service program that is AmeriCorps. And she puts this forward as something that like should happen in the world, but not without realizing this is like something that exists in our world now. And it wouldn't have bothered me as much, but I finished this book the same day that a congressperson, two congresspeople actually did the same thing. And it's just like, there had to have been some basic research in this book, and it just angered me that like it was just not really caught. It was like calling for something that literally exists already without actually naming that thing and pointing people towards it. But anyway, there's nothing for you here. I was maybe harsher on it than I think other people would be. I thought the parts of her with Trump in the White House were interesting, especially if you don't know anything. I think that a lot of that stuff has been reported to death, to be honest with you. And I think a lot of Trump is exactly who you think he's going to be if you've done any kind of reading on him whatsoever of people who have actually worked in his administration. There wasn't really anything new there. But it was interesting enough, other than the proliferation stuff. But it was interesting to get her take on it. And it was interesting because I think she has an interesting perspective, having come from England and having been an expert in Russia, to kind of triangulate those things. Who would I recommend reading this book? I would recommend anybody who who is interested in the topic and is just kind of wants something to give you kind of a broad brush of all those things, and who is not going to get too bogged down on the realism of some of these solutions. She does end with, again, calls for specific people, depending on where your station is in life, to do specific things, which I appreciated. I think sometimes people write books and they just feel like the reader is everybody. And I think at the end she says, here are the things that you can do differently if you're a CEO. The problem with the CEO thing is she acknowledges earlier in the book that she believes millennials and Gen Z are in a specifically bad situation given the financial crisis, and she kind of tiptoes to the line of giving them preferential treatment. She actually does call for kind of preferential treatment for minority and female candidates. Again, I would have really liked to have seen her discussion with Richard Reeves on Of Boys and Men. I would have been really interested to see what she thought about that book, because I think she does acknowledge that the gender wage gap is closed, but she still seems to feel that it's a very pernicious thing. And I kind of disagree with that take on it. Anyway, I talked enough long about the book. If you're interested in the concept, it's not too long of a book to get through. I felt that there could have been trimming, and I had a lot of issues with, I think, the outcome of it. But there's nothing for you here by Fiona Hill. Next time, I'm going to be reading Fatherland by Robert Harris, which is kind of one of the biggest alternative history sci-fi novels of all time, so I'm looking forward to that. If you did read this book, and this video is now 22 minutes long, which is crazy, if you did read this book and had a different take than me and really enjoyed it, I know I didn't get too super deep into her personal history. I'm sure that there are people who would find it much more inspiring than I did. I think part of that is because she comes from a place where everybody should be striving to work for public service. That's also, I keep trying to end and other things keep coming back. She seems to have this attitude, while acknowledging that the 2008 Great Recession happened. She seems to be almost instinctively defensive of the criticisms that the government has caused bad things to happen to people. And by that I mean, when she doesn't seem to make the connection between the populist movement and the actual harms done by the Great Recession, which in large part were either ignored by the federal government or in part places caused by the federal government. She doesn't seem to get there. And that also it was a blind spot that I saw again and again, where I was like, is she going to get there? Because anytime she starts talking about oh man, people are coming from public servants and these things, and it's like, well, they're part of the federal government and people are very angry about these things that they feel have harmed them. And it's pretty natural for them to be angry about them. And she doesn't really seem to get to the own up part of that in a way that I thought was strange to me, because she does acknowledge how terrible it was for people not in the government. She doesn't get to the point where acknowledging the government's role and why it was so bad. Anyway, I'm going to end it for real this time. If you've read this, please like the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. The videos usually aren't this long, but I the more I thought about this, kind of the more I went in on it. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel if you have not already. If you've read this and I'm way off base, please write something below. I'd be curious to how other people felt about the book. I'm not a woman, and I have, to the best of my knowledge, not experienced great sexism at the workplace. And so maybe this would resonate more with people who have. For me, it was pretty easy to say, well, those things that you're describing happened 20, 30 years ago, and I'm not advocating for sexism, but I can also understand why at a time where there was less ability to check employers, that they would try to get away with more stuff. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading Fatherland. Until next time, bye.